On March 6, 2026, 7 days into Operation Epic Fury, Donald Trump posted 4 words to Truth Social that redefined the objectives of the war against Iran. UN conditional surrender, all capital letters, no negotiation, no compromise, no off-ramp, just a demand that echoes across 81 years of American military history back to a single precedent. The terms the United States gave Japan in 1945 after 2 atomic bombs and the total collapse of its imperial military. That is not a Middle East counter-terrorism operation. That is regime annihilation doctrine. And what Trump said next made the calculation explicit. After Iran surrenders unconditionally, he wrote, the United States and its allies will select a great and acceptable leader to replace the government we just destroyed. Then we will rebuild Iran and make it economically bigger, better and stronger than ever before. He ended with a slogan, make Iran great again. MEGA. This is not 2003 Iraq all over again. This is 2003 Iraq on a compressed timeline with the lessons unlearned and the mistakes front-loaded. Because the United States did not formally demand Saddam Hussein's unconditional surrender before the invasion. It gave him 48 hours to leave. It offered exile. It created an off-ramp that Saddam rejected. What Trump is offering Iran is mathematically different. He is publicly, explicitly, in writing, stating that the war will continue until the Iranian government ceases to exist in its current form and a leader acceptable to Donald Trump personally is installed in Tehran. And when the White House press secretary was asked to clarify what unconditional surrender means, she said it means when Trump, as commander-in-chief, determines that Iran no longer poses a threat to the United States and the goals of Operation Epic Fury have been fully realized, then Iran will essentially be in a place of unconditional surrender, whether they say it themselves or not. That is the framework. The war does not end when Iran stops firing missiles. It does not end when its nuclear program is dismantled. It does not end when its navy is destroyed, which according to Trump it already is. The war ends when Donald Trump decides it ends. And the criteria for that decision is not a military benchmark. It is a political one. The installation of a government in Tehran that Trump considers acceptable. Trump clarified this in a phone call to Axios on March 6th. He said unconditional surrender could be that the Iranians announce it, but it could also be when they can't fight any longer because they don't have anyone or anything to fight with. That second formulation is the one that matters because it means the war continues until Iran's entire capacity to resist American force projection in the region has been eliminated, not degraded, eliminated. That is not a counter-terrorism campaign. That is the destruction of a state's sovereign military power as a precondition to political reconstruction. But here is the part that turns unconditional surrender from a slogan into a structural trap. Trump has already told the world exactly which Iranian leader he will not accept. Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the front-runner. The man who, according to multiple reports, has already been elected by Iran's Assembly of Experts in a rushed vote on March 3rd, 2 days before Trump's unconditional surrender post. Trump called him a lightweight. He said Mojtaba is unacceptable to me. He said I have to be involved in the appointment like with Delcy in Venezuela. That comparison is the entire game. In January 2026, Trump ordered US forces to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and bring him to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, assumed power, and within weeks she began cooperating with the United States. She allowed American oil companies access to Venezuela's reserves. She cut off petroleum supplies to Cuba. She did what Trump wanted under the explicit threat that if she did not, the violence would continue. That is the Venezuela model, and Trump just told the world he intends to apply it to Iran. The problem is that Iran is not Venezuela. Venezuela's government collapsed under the weight of economic sanctions, hyperinflation and mass emigration before Trump sent in the extraction team. Iran is fighting back. It is launching ballistic missiles at Israel. It is sending drones at US bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It is closing the Strait of Hormuz. It is threatening to kill thousands of American soldiers if the US attempts a ground invasion. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on March 6 that Iran's plan for a clean, rapid military victory has failed, and Plan B will be an even bigger failure. The next day, President Masoud Pezeshkian said Iran will never capitulate. He said some countries are mediating, but mediation should address those who underestimated the Iranian people and ignited this conflict. This is where the doctrine collides with the reality. Trump's unconditional surrender demand requires that Iran's current leadership either formally surrender, which Pezeshkian has now publicly refused to do, or that their capacity to fight be destroyed so completely that surrender becomes irrelevant because there is no one left to resist. The White House says the campaign may run 4 to 6 more weeks, but 6 weeks from March 6th is mid-April 2026, and in 6 weeks the United States will have spent approximately $25 billion based on the current burn rate of $891 million per day that the Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated for the first 100 hours of the war. That is $25 billion to destroy the Iranian military's ability to project force. But the Iranian military is not what is preventing unconditional surrender. The Iranian government is, and the Iranian government is not going to surrender because Trump declared on social media that it must. So what happens next? There are 3 scenarios that flow directly from the unconditional surrender framework, and none of them end cleanly. Scenario 1, Iran's government collapses internally. The assembly of experts facing the total destruction of the country's military and economic infrastructure deposes Mojtaba Khamenei before he is even formally announced and installs a leader willing to negotiate terms acceptable to Trump. This is what happened in Japan in 1945. Emperor Hirohito overruled his military commanders and accepted the Potsdam Declaration after Nagasaki. But Iran in 2026 is not Japan in 1945. Japan had already lost its navy, its air force, and its ability to defend its home islands before the atomic bombs fell. Its cities were already burning. Iran still has ballistic missiles in hardened silos. It still has the Revolutionary Guard. It still has proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. It still has the ability to strike American allies and close the Strait of Hormuz, even if its conventional navy is destroyed. Destroying Iran's capacity to resist is not a 6-week air campaign. It is years, and the Iranian government knows that. Scenario 2, the United States launches a ground invasion to force regime change. This is what Secretary of State Marco Rubio has quietly told Arab foreign ministers the war is designed to avoid, according to sources who spoke to Axios. But if unconditional surrender is the objective and Iran refuses to surrender and the air campaign does not produce internal collapse, then ground forces are the only mechanism left to install a leader acceptable to Trump. Trump himself dismissed this possibility in an interview with NBC on March 6th. He called it a waste of time, but that dismissal was based on the claim that Iran has already lost everything: Iran's navy, its air force, its air defenses, its radar. Trump said they can't fight any longer, but Iran is still fighting. It launched a combined drone and missile attack on Tel Aviv on March 5th. It fired 7 attack drones at civilian neighborhoods in Bahrain. It struck an oil refinery. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. These are not the actions of a country that has lost the capacity to resist. These are the actions of a country prosecuting an asymmetric war against superior conventional forces. And asymmetric wars do not end with unconditional surrender. They end with exhaustion, stalemate, or occupation. Scenario 3, the war continues indefinitely at escalating cost until Trump redefines what unconditional surrender means. This is the most likely outcome, because the gap between Trump's stated objective and the military reality on the ground is not closable in 6 weeks. Danny Citranovich, an Iran expert at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies and the Atlantic Council, said it directly. If this is the official position of the US administration, and given the fact that the current regime in Iran will not surrender, then the campaign will have to continue until the collapse of the current regime. Anything short of that would effectively be considered a failure despite all the operational successes of the campaign. That is the trap. Trump has publicly committed the United States to a maximalist objective that requires either the total military destruction of Iran's capacity to fight or a political transformation of its government. Both of those outcomes require sustained military operations far beyond the 4 to 6 week timeline the White House is projecting. And every additional week costs $6.2 billion at current burn rates, money that, according to CSIS, is not budgeted. But cost is not the binding constraint. The binding constraint is that unconditional surrender doctrine only works if one side has the power to impose it and the will to follow through. The United States had both against Japan in 1945. It had atomic weapons, total air and naval superiority, and the political consensus to use them. The United States has air superiority over Iran in 2026, but it does not have ground control, it does not have a weapon that can force immediate capitulation, and it does not have domestic or international political support for an indefinite war of regime annihilation. Spain has already refused to allow the US to use its bases for strikes on Iran. Trump threatened to cut off all trade with Spain in response. NATO allies are reluctantly being pulled into the conflict, but they are not enthusiastic participants. They are risk-managing participants trying to avoid becoming targets themselves. And then there is the succession question. Trump says he has to be involved in selecting Iran's next supreme leader. He says Mojtaba Khamenei is unacceptable, but Iran's Assembly of Experts has constitutional authority to select the supreme leader. It is an 88-member clerical body elected by popular vote. On March 3rd, the Assembly held an emergency session to vote on Khamenei's successor. According to Iran International, IRGC commanders pressured Assembly members to vote for Mojtaba. The vote was held online under what members described as an unnatural atmosphere. Limited time was given to opponents to speak. Discussion was cut off. A vote was cast. Then, after the votes were counted, but before the result was announced, US and Israeli bombs hit the Assembly of Experts building in Qom. The attack occurred while the vote count was in progress. Some reports claim the bombing specifically targeted the meeting. The result was announced to Assembly members after the strike. Objections were raised. A second session was scheduled for March 5th. Trump's position is that this entire process is irrelevant, that he will be involved in the appointment, that the person selected must be acceptable to him. But the mechanism by which Trump intends to enforce that involvement is unclear. Does the United States bomb the Assembly of Experts every time they vote for someone Trump does not approve? Does it continue the war until the Assembly selects a candidate from a list Trump provides? Does it invade, dissolve the Assembly, and install a provisional government? None of these options end with a stable pro-American government in Tehran. They end with a failed state, an insurgency, or a civil war that makes Iraq's sectarian conflict look restrained. Trump compared his Iran strategy to Venezuela, but Venezuela and Iran operate under entirely different power structures. Delcy Rodriguez cooperated with Trump because she inherited a government that was already economically destroyed and internationally isolated. She had no capacity to resist and no incentive to fight. Mojtaba Khamenei, if he is formally installed, inherits the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, ballistic missile stockpiles, and a 45-year-old revolutionary ideology that defines itself in opposition to American hegemony. Cooperation is not an option for him the way it was for Rodriguez, because cooperation with the United States is ideological suicide for anyone who holds power in the Islamic Republic. And if Mojtaba is replaced by someone else under American pressure, that person faces the same structural constraint. Any Iranian leader who surrenders unconditionally to the United States and allows Trump to dictate terms is signing his own death warrant from internal hardliners who will view him as a traitor. This is the paradox at the center of unconditional surrender doctrine applied to ideological regimes. You can destroy their military, you can kill their leaders, you can occupy their territory, but you cannot force them to accept terms that delegitimize the foundational narrative of their political system without replacing that system entirely through prolonged occupation and political reconstruction. The United States did that in Japan. It took 7 years of military occupation under General Douglas MacArthur to transform Japan from an imperial military state into a constitutional democracy. 7 years. The United States attempted it in Iraq. It took 8 years, 4,000 American deaths, hundreds of billions of dollars, and the result was not a stable democracy. It was sectarian fragmentation, the rise of ISIS, and a government in Baghdad that is now more aligned with Iran than with Washington. Trump's unconditional surrender demand is betting that Iran will collapse faster and cleaner than Iraq did, that the combination of airstrikes, economic pressure, and the assassination of its supreme leader will produce a government willing to accept American terms without requiring ground occupation. That bet is not supported by history, it is not supported by the structure of the Iranian state, and it is not supported by the actions Iran is taking right now, which are the actions of a country preparing for a long war, not a country preparing to surrender. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi posted a photo of the coffins of a mother and child killed in US-Israeli strikes. He wrote, "Our brave and powerful armed forces will avenge each and every Iranian mother, father and child who has been targeted by hostile forces." That is not surrender language. That is resistance language. And resistance does not end with unconditional terms dictated by the aggressor. It ends with negotiated settlements, frozen conflicts, or generational insurgencies. Here is what unconditional surrender doctrine does accomplish, even if it does not produce actual surrender. It eliminates any diplomatic path to de-escalation that preserves the current Iranian government. Because if the United States' stated position is that there will be no deal except unconditional surrender, then any negotiation short of that is a concession. Any ceasefire that leaves the Islamic Republic intact is a retreat from Trump's declared objective, and that creates a domestic political trap for Trump himself, because he has now committed his administration to a maximalist goal that his own military and intelligence officials know is not achievable in the time frame the White House is advertising. If the war drags into summer, if costs spiral past $50 billion, if American casualties mount, if Iran keeps the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil hits $150 per barrel, Trump will face a choice. He can escalate to ground invasion, which he has already called a waste of time, or he can declare victory based on the destruction of Iran's navy and air defenses and redefine what unconditional surrender means in practice. That second option is what happened in Korea. The United States entered the Korean War to repel North Korean aggression and unify the peninsula. It ended the war with an armistice that divided the peninsula permanently. The objective changed. Unconditional surrender became ceasefire. Victory became stalemate. But there is a cost to redefining victory after declaring unconditional surrender. The cost is credibility, because every adversary watching this war is learning the same lesson, that American declarations of maximalist objectives are negotiating positions, not operational commitments, that unconditional surrender means whatever the United States decides it means when the costs of continuing exceed the benefits of persisting. That lesson matters because Trump's entire foreign policy framework is built on projecting dominance through the threat of overwhelming force. He captured Maduro, he killed Khamenei, he is destroying Iran's military at record pace, faster than any air campaign in recent history according to Air Wars, and yet Iran is still fighting, it is still launching missiles, it is still closing the Strait of Hormuz, it is still refusing to surrender. If 6 months from now Iran's government is still intact and the war is still ongoing, and Trump has quietly dropped the unconditional surrender language, every other adversary will recalculate the risk of resisting American demands, because they will have watched Iran resist for months and survive. That is the strategic cost of unconditional surrender doctrine when it is not backed by the capacity and will to impose it. It turns a maximalist demand into a credibility test, and if the test fails, the damage is not limited to Iran. It extends to every future confrontation where the United States threatens force to compel behavior change, which is why unconditional surrender should never be declared unless the party declaring it has already achieved the military conditions necessary to enforce it. Japan surrendered unconditionally in 1945 because its cities were burning, its navy was destroyed, and 2 atomic bombs had demonstrated that the United States could annihilate the entire country without landing a single soldier. The military outcome was decided before the demand was made. That is not the situation in Iran on March 7, 2026. The military outcome is ongoing, the costs are escalating, the timeline is extending, and the Iranian government, far from preparing to surrender, is preparing for what its leaders openly describe as a long war of attrition designed to outlast American political will. That is what makes Trump's unconditional surrender demand not a statement of strength, but a gamble that Iran will break before the costs become politically unsustainable, a gamble that air power alone can destroy a government without occupation, a gamble that the United States can select a new Iranian leader, and that leader will govern effectively without being killed by the same forces that resisted American intervention for 45 years. And if the gamble fails, the United States will be left with a choice: double down with a ground invasion that Trump has already dismissed, or redefine victory and accept a negotiated outcome that preserves some version of the Islamic Republic in exchange for verifiable limits on its military capabilities and regional activities. That second option is not unconditional surrender. It is a deal, and Trump has already said there will be no deal except unconditional surrender, which means that when the deal is eventually struck, because wars of this scale and cost always end in deals, Trump will have to explain why unconditional surrender turned into conditional compromise. The answer will be the same answer every president gives when maximalist rhetoric meets operational reality. We achieved our core objectives, we degraded the threat, we protected American interest, we are bringing our troops home. But the troops are not in Iran yet. The question is whether they will be, and whether the doctrine of unconditional surrender will force them there.